Hi everyone, so today's lesson is on consecutive integers. And consecutive integers, for some reasons, gives kids a hard time, but it's really, it's not that hard if you think about what the word consecutive means. And in math, when we say consecutive, we mean one right next to another. So if I said the number 1, the next number would be 2. And if I said a consecutive number before 1, then the number would be 0. So those are consecutive numbers. Now, if we throw the word integer in it, let's remember that an integer is a positive or a negative whole number. So like -2 is an integer, -3 is an integer, but 1/2 is not an integer because it's not whole, it's a fraction. All right, so when we are talking about integers, we usually represent an integer with a letter n, okay, by the letter n, or at least we're going to in our class, okay? So let's talk about that. If the first integer is n, what would the next 3 integers be? Well, think about it. If they're 1 away from each other because they're right next to each other, then we just add 1 to n. So n plus 1 would be that next integer. And then the one right after that would be n plus 2, and then n plus 3. Okay, so let's think about that now and write the integer that immediately precedes n. And that means comes before n. What does precede mean? Pre means before, okay? So if n is the integer, the one right before it would be n minus 1. And think of that. If I was at the number 1 and I wanted to go back 1, I would go in the left direction. I'd go back 1, which is -1. All right, so let's write an equation that states the sum of 4 consecutive integers starting with n is 66, okay? All right, so n is our first integer, okay? So n is the first integer. So we want the sum, so I know I'm going to be adding 4 things together. The first one's n, so the next consecutive integer would be n plus 1. The next one would be n plus 2. The next one would be n plus 3, and we want them to equal 66. So now we've just written an algebraic equation relating 4 consecutive integers. All right, here let's try this one. 10, 12, and 22 are even integers. If you know and understand that, can you write a definition that defines an even integer? Okay, well, an even integer is a positive or negative even whole number. Positive or negative even whole number. So 2, 4, 6, 8, who do we appreciate? Those are all even integers. If I made them all negative, they would also be even integers. What do you notice about them? Well, first time I was talking about even integers when I was younger, I looked at them and I was like, gosh, they're 2 away from each other. I have to add 2 to get to the next integer, even integer. Add 2 to get to the next even integer. All right, so we have to come up with a plan for what we're going to do if I talk about even integers, okay? So if n is the first even integer, then the next even integer would be n plus 2. Remember, 2, 4, 6, and 8, they were 2 away from each other. And then n plus 4 is the next consecutive even integer, okay? All right, now let's look at odd integers. If n is the first odd integer, so we're odd numbers, I don't know, 3, 5, 7, what you might notice is they're also 2 away from each other. So if we're talking about odd integers and we say n is the first odd integer, the next one would also be n plus 2 and n plus 4. So we have to be careful and look carefully at the words that they give us. It could say just consecutive integer, which would be n, n plus 1, n plus 2. Or it could say consecutive even or odd integer. And then you'd have to do n, n plus 2, or n plus 4. Okay? All right, let's try. The sum of 3 consecutive odd integers is 100. Okay, so I'm going to let n equal the first odd integer. Okay, and it says the sum of 3 odd integers, so n, n plus 2, and n plus 4, and it wants their sum. So I'm going to add them together because sum means add, is, so equals, 100 more than, so plus, the smallest integer. Well, the smallest integer is the first one, n. So 100 more than n. And there I have an equation. All right, let's try another one. The sum of 3 consecutive odd integers is 75. All right, we're going to let n equal the first odd integer. So then our equation would be n plus 1 plus n plus 2. There's 3 odd integers, 1, 2, and 3, and that sum is 75. Okay, what do we got next? 4 cousins were born at 2-year intervals. The sum of their ages is 36. Okay, now this is a little bit trickier. 4 people were born at 2-year intervals. That means every 2 years. Okay, so that means I'm going to let n equal the first cousin's year of birth. All right, well, the sum of their ages, so that would be n plus 2, n plus 4, and n plus 6. Those are the 4 cousins if they had 2-year intervals in the years they were born, and their sum was 36. All right, guys, so I hope that gave you an idea of how you can write an equation using integers, consecutive integers, or consecutive odd and even integers. Thanks, and have a great night.